Did you know that the forgotten founder of Zionism went on to play a leading role in Agudas Yisrael, or that Rav Chatzkel Abramsky was responsible for the continued presence of the Muslim Waqf on Har HaBayis? It turns out that the margins of history tell the real story. Behind the Times dives into the big concepts and overlooked moments that carry vast meaning, all through the lens of Torah and rabbinic thought. Join me, Gedalia Gutentag, as I go behind the Times to explore the forgotten history, remarkable personalities, and transformative moments that shape current events and explain how we got here. Behind the Times with Gedalia Gutentag. A few days ago, a disturbing video emerged from a kibbutz on Israel's northern border with Lebanon. It shows soldiers running for cover. Some are shouting and pointing skyward. Still others fire their weapon in bursts, the telltale puffs of smoke rising into the air. Their target? Tiny first-person view drones. Little more than toys, actually, now turned into Hezbollah's latest deadly weapon. Already during Israel's war with Hezbollah, a year or two ago, it became clear that the country had a problem. Iranian-supplied drones were penetrating deep into Israeli airspace, photographing and sometimes striking sensitive military sites. Israel had become an anti-rocket superpower, but these slow, cheap, hard-to-detect aircraft exposed an uncomfortable gap. But now, with the FPV drones, as they're called, the threat has evolved again. These are no longer the large, noisy Shahed-type drones from Iran, once used to attack radar stations or anti-aircraft batteries. These are tiny FPV drones equipped with explosive payloads, hunting individual soldiers, chasing vehicles, and increasingly spreading fear among frontline units. All of which raises urgent questions that I want to consider as I go solo, without my dear partner, Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Galitsky. But perhaps going solo is suitable for an episode that explores Israel's drone deficit. How did Israel, of all countries, get caught on the hop by the drone age? Because if there is one country on earth that was supposed to understand drone warfare before anyone else, it was Israel. In fact, many of the ideas that shaped modern drone combat were pioneered here. So what happened? How did the country that helped invent modern drone warfare suddenly find itself scrambling to catch up with the next generation of it? As we answer that question, I want to explore the lives of a couple of the tinkerers and remarkable innovators who triggered Israel's leap forward in the 1960s and 70s in the use of drones. Perhaps most importantly, what direction will this new age of warfare now take? And in the episode ahead, perhaps we can also gain some perspective on how a thinking Jew should look at the ebb and flow of technology and warfare itself, the endless cycle of breakthrough and surprise, invention and counter-invention, attack and defense, and the question of what ultimately lies behind it all. To understand why Israel became one of the world's great drone pioneers, you first have to understand the trauma that was the Yom Kippur War. Until 1973, the Israeli Air Force was viewed as almost invincible. The stunning victories of the Six-Day War were brought about primarily by air superiority. That stunning opening strike on the Egyptian and Syrian air forces meant that during that first day, and in those first hours, in fact, the war, in a sense, was all but won. But that victory created an assumption in Israel and internationally that air superiority would dominate Middle Eastern warfare for the foreseeable future. And in fact, that doctrine underlay Israel's lackadaisical approach, almost criminally so, to the gathering threat that was Sadat's preparation for the Yom Kippur War. Because even though Israeli military intelligence could see the large concentrations of Syrian troops and armor on the other side of the Golan Heights, and they could see on the other side of the Suez Canal the vast buildup of the Egyptians, they said it's okay, we only need to have these puny forces on the canal and on the heights themselves because our Air Force will do the job. And then came October 1973. Israeli aircraft on that holy day suddenly found themselves flying into a shocking new phenomenon. Dense walls of Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles should be supplied to Egypt and Syria. Pilots who only a few years earlier had roamed Arab skies almost uncontested were suddenly being hunted by radar-guided missile batteries stretching across the fronts. Again and again, Israeli aircraft trying to strike the Egyptian bridgeheads across the Suez Canal were thrown back with massive losses. The losses, in fact, were so extensive that America had to fly its own Phantom jets to Israel to replace the jets that had been struck down, leading to the Egyptian and wider Arab claim and myth that the Americans were intervening directly and flying on behalf of the Israelis. At moments during the war, Israeli air power was effectively paralyzed, which meant that the ground troops also couldn't make breakthroughs. The old assumptions about air power collapsed overnight. For the first time, Israeli planners were forced to contemplate a terrifying possibility. What if modern anti-aircraft systems could neutralize Israel's greatest strategic advantage? And that question became an obsession among Israeli strategists. How do you destroy missile batteries that can shoot down your aircraft before they even reach their targets? How do you gather intelligence on those missile systems without sacrificing pilots? So at first, Israel turned to American-made solutions. The Israeli Air Force acquired large American-made drones known as Firebees, made by the Ryan Company. The systems looked futuristic, and in fact, the Americans had been in the drone business for a long time because drones themselves, the idea of pilotless aircraft, had this overlap and been going on for decades back before the Second World War. And in fact, there's a lot of overlap between that and rocket technology or guided rockets and V-2s as the Nazis flew towards the end of the war. But going back to the American drones, the systems looked futuristic, but they had distinct problems. It created an intelligence cycle that was painfully slow. What happened was that the drones, the Firebees, photographed enemy positions on film, and then often these drones couldn't land, so they had to basically drop the film, physically recovered, and then the recovery of the drones was a separate balagan. But anyway, the film had to be brought to intelligence centers, where analysts would examine the imagery frame by frame, trying to distinguish between the shadow of a tree and the shadow of a missile launcher, and the process could take hours. And by then, this was the critical flaw. Given that these were basically aeroplane-sized systems that showed up on radar sets, Egypt or Syria, for example, realized the site had been exposed by one of these drones, and they could relocate launchers or camouflage positions or construct decoys or such deception operations. And so, unless there was an incredibly quick turnaround, so the operational value was often very little. By the time the photographs reached the analysts, the battlefield had already moved on. And meanwhile, on the ground, what was happening was that the fear of the SAM batteries, surface-to-air missile batteries, spread far beyond the Air Force. What actually happened, absurdly, the Israeli Air Force ended up being so neutered in the Yom Kippur War that it was actually ground forces that had to hunt the SAM sites. What happened was Ariel Sharon's forces crossed the Suez Canal in between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd Army, and they received strange maps marked with mysterious flower symbols. Tank crews were instructed that to proceed to drive into the open desert to where they're going to find these flower symbols, and they were to fire at the box in the middle that they found in the middle. Because what actually happened was that these flower symbols marked the surface-to-air missile sites. The armored soldiers did not actually know what they were looking for. The flowers were those surface-to-air missile batteries, and the box in the middle was the command and control center. The tank commanders learned that it was actually great fun. What they did is they fired a shell at this, the truck in the middle, the box in the middle, the computer brain, and the missile batteries obviously went haywire. Missiles gyrated and exploded all over the place, and it was great fun. They were hunting the flowers. But in essence, that was a desperation to regain the control of the skies that Israeli tanks were effectively being used to hunt anti-aircraft systems, which was crazy. The Yom Kippur War convinced Israeli planners that unless the sand problem could somehow be solved, Israel's entire military doctrine was up in smoke. And so that obsession would eventually lead to one of the great revolutions in modern warfare. One of the most fascinating figures in this story was an unconventional Israeli intelligence officer named Shabtai Brill. Brill didn't come from the Air Force hierarchy, but from Amman, Israeli military intelligence, where creativity and improvisation often mattered a lot. At some point in the late 1960s, Brill noticed the growing hobby of radio-controlled model airplanes that was arriving from America. Now, while most people saw toys, Brill saw the intelligence-gathering future. The prevailing Cold War assumption was that reconnaissance drones, as we said before, like the Ryan Farby, had to be large, fast, and sophisticated. In other words, it was clear they were going to be picked up by enemy radar, so they had to be quick enough to punch in and punch out and to evade the anti-aircraft missile system, which created this loop that they obviously devalued the intelligence that it actually gathered. But Brill, with his brilliant Gemara cop, obviously thought the opposite. He said, what if we don't have drones that are so large that they have to be powerful enough to outrun the radar and missiles? Why not build something so small, slow, and quiet that it just simply doesn't get picked up by the radar whatsoever? So what does he do? Together with some fellow enthusiasts and tinkerers, I suppose you could call them, he begins experimenting with these tiny radio-controlled aircraft carrying cameras. And so naturally, the big established bureaucracy, the senior brass of the Israeli Air Force said, no, it's toys, they're messing around. But actually, as it was, given the competition between the different services, Amman, military intelligence, which was where Shabtai Brill worked, became interested. Because, yeah, maybe it's worth looking into if you have these secret agents with wings. That was the breakthrough, because the future of warfare would not therefore belong to the biggest, most sophisticated systems. Sometimes it belongs to the basic, small systems that simply are too small to actually matter. Brill's early experiments worked very, very well. In one late 1960s test, a small Israeli drone flew over Egyptian missile positions and returned with very, very clear imagery. And the point was, no one had picked it up. It was basically a tiny little flying lawnmower. And suddenly, the toy looked revolutionary, like a piece of the military future. Now, actually, what happened, the process that happened next, showed, I think you could call, sort of a remarkable parallel to the early days of Silicon Valley. And that's actually a very interesting comparison. Because one of the pivotal figures of the Israel's drone revolution was a guy called Alvin Ellis, an American who moved to Israel in 1967 and joined what's called the Ta'asiyah Avirit, IAI, or Israel Aircraft Industries, which is one of the country's biggest today defense firms. Now, after studying the lessons and the problems that the Air Force had encountered in the Yom Kippur War, Mr. Ellis was convinced that drones were the future. So together with a guy called Yehuda Manor, he began, literally Silicon Valley style, to build prototypes UAVs in a garage. And obviously, there's strong comparisons. We're going to take this Silicon Valley's early startup day comparison further to, you imagine Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, cobbling together the first Apple computers literally in a garage somewhere in California, wherever it was. And so here you have the site. It was little teams and kind of everything's improvised and ad hoc and unpolished, and basically think tinkerers who's, enthusiasts and mishuganers who won't give up on something despite the fact that everyone else thinks they are crazy. And at first, the project struggled for backing because IAI rejected the idea. And what happened was Tadiran, which is one of Israel's electronics companies, but, Tadiran is really a conglomerate. I think they make air conditioning and they used to make fridges. They're into different things. I think they do lifts as well now, elevators. They fund the development of what became one of the first operational successful drones exported to the US as the Mastiff. And the philosophy behind the system was very Israeli. It was very kol lavan. It was very, it was falafel, as opposed to the big American expensive steak, because it was small, it was cheap, and it was persistent, and it was crucially capable of real-time surveillance, as opposed to the expensive American systems which needed to break through, to hurtle through and to evade all the radar systems to get that physical kind of reel back to the intel technicians. It just went inside, photographed and live streamed it, and got out. So Israel wasn't simply photographing the battlefield, it was operating inside it continuously. It wasn't just tinkering with drones, it was actually reinventing them. In June 1982 came the big test. It was the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. Remember, this is 9 years after the shock of the Yom Kippur War, when the Israeli Air Force was humiliated. During those 9 years, the Air Force had fundamentally rethought things and had worked single-mindedly on the crucial national security project of how to destroy these vast Soviet-supplied anti-aircraft arrays. Israel faced one of the densest Soviet-style anti-aircraft missile systems in the world over Syria. Syrian sand batteries spread across Lebanon under heavy Soviet guidance and doctrine. And obviously only a decade earlier, the war had shown how dangerous these systems could be. And now was the crunch time. Israel wanted to destroy them. And what in fact happened stunned military planners across the world. Because in a battle, and air-to-ground battle, Israel destroyed the entire anti-aircraft array and the Syrian Air Force. And that effort was led by the drones. Large decoy drones imitated fighter aircraft and showed up cruising around, and they caused the Syrian radar operators to activate the missile systems and try and shoot down the Israeli Air Force. But in the process, these were just the phantoms. These were the fakes. In the process, Syria was wasting all its missiles against unmanned targets. Meanwhile, smaller drones were quietly feeding live intelligence back to Israeli operators. They were tracking Syrian aircraft and missile batteries in real time. And once the Syrian radars activated, Israel deployed new anti-radiation missiles, which are basically missiles whose nose cone, the seeker, latches on to the radar systems and basically rides the radar waves right down to the emitter, to the radar itself, smashes into them and destroys them. And what happens when ground forces actually targeted the missile defense system command centers at the same time? The upshot was that within hours, much of Syria's missile network was shattered. And what followed was one of the most lopsided air battles ever, because Israel was able to shoot down dozens of Syrian aircraft without losing a single aircraft in combat. And obviously that stunned Western military observers, but it also stunned the Soviets. Because interestingly enough, when the Iron Curtain had fallen, a Soviet general actually told the Israelis that it was that display of Israeli drone and anti-missile and overall air superiority that convinced the Soviets that they had fallen behind and they could not match Western technology. So in retrospect, some historians view the Bekaa Valley battle as the Middle Eastern battle that actually was in some way sped up the end of the Cold War itself. But what is for certain is that the battle over the Bekaa Valley showed that the drone age truly arrived. One of the figures who would carry that revolution into the wider world was a Baghdad-born Israeli engineer who's still around, living in Los Angeles, named Avraham or Abe Karem. Now, Karem's story is just one of these amazing stories of Israeli startup culture that kind of feels symbolic of the broader drone story. He was born in Iraq, and he actually obviously went through the Farhud, which was the riots, the anti-Jewish riots in 1948 that triggered the exodus, basically, of the vast majority of Iraqi Jews. And he immigrated to Israel as part of that great wave. And he'd been fascinated by model aircraft from childhood. I think he'd had a teacher who had flown a Lancaster bomber British Lancaster bomber in the Second World War. And he studied aeronautics at the Technion in Haifa, and he joined the Israeli Air Force engineering world. And he later recalled that the culture then of innovation amongst Israeli engineers was such that whereas it takes currently something like 20 years to get something from the drawing board into the battlefield in America, back then, he said, an Israeli team could move from concept to flight testing in 6 months. And that's just going to be a very, very crucial part of the story over here. And that shaped what he did. And the lessons Karam absorbed were profound, that you had to have small teams moving quickly and breaking things. Those people who were, furiously dedicated to innovation could out-innovate these giant bureaucracies. And then he moved to America, and he encounters something entirely different. Because what had happened is by the late 1970s, the Pentagon had basically given up on drones because the American programs are very expensive and very bureaucratic. And one of the stage at which Americans were up to when he arrived was that it needed dozens of people to launch this particular version of the drone that they had. And so Karam said to the Americans, you don't get what's happening over here. So what does he do? He's an Israeli. He's arriving in the capital of, in the Silicon Valley area, innovation. So he gets a garage and he starts tinkering, putting stuff together using plywood and fiberglass and little engineering teams. He developed an Israeli style of drone. And eventually the system he created evolved into something very, very recognizable even decades later, America's Predator drone, which was one of the defining military technologies after 9/11. I think this was the drone by which operators could sit back home in Wyoming and hunt Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan using the killer drone. But Karam's importance was that he understood what the incumbents were doing wrong. He said the incumbents, these sort of giant aerospace companies, have a problem creating anything that competes with what they're already doing, he said. You need inventors who are dreaming and tinkering to make new things happen. That quote explains the entire drone revolution, because from Shabtai Brill's model airplanes to Ukrainian FPV workshops that we're going to see, the future arrived from the tinkerers before the large institutions recognized what they were looking at. But the drones that Israel pioneered still belong to what we might call the first drone age, because these were elite systems, sort of reconnaissance platforms, precision tools, and they required this sort of giant and sophisticated American military bureaucracy to produce. And what came next was something very different. It was firstly much cheaper. FPV drones emerged out of the Chinese consumer electronics and people wearing gaming goggles and hobbyist engineering, basically people jerry-rigging different systems very, very cheap. And then what happened is Ukraine turned them into weapons. This is very important to understand, because what Ukraine did upended modern warfare. What they did was democratized air power. The Ukrainians have shown that a very much weaker military power can use enormous quantities of cheap, throwaway, disposable drones that are worth a couple of $100 to exhaust, really, a much larger army. And so you have all of these videos, these crazy videos of Ukrainian drones hunting and destroying $1 million tank, Russian tank, or going after individual soldiers. And it's got to the point where the front lines is basically, without drones, you can't move there. It's a drone hunting arena. And now what happened actually was that the problem was that now it became obvious to many that this new model of warfare would eventually arrive here in the Middle East. And yet Israel appears to have drawn the wrong conclusions. I think what happened is that because Hamas only used them to a limited extent initially on October the 7th, they didn't have the saturation and access to FPV drones that Ukraine did, that essentially Israel seems to have absorbed the lessons that drones are dangerous but manageable. And you could manage them with existing technology and doctrine. But what happened is that technology kept evolving. And Iran accelerated drone production, and then Hezbollah adapted. Suddenly, Israel has found itself confronting a battlefield where drones are no longer just surveillance tools or flying bombs aimed at infrastructure, but cheap weapons capable of hunting individual soldiers. And so you get to the stage where one of the world's most advanced militaries is forced to improvise very quickly with primitive defenses. And Israel has absorbed and rushed shotguns to the front line because essentially they give frontline soldiers the ability or a chance to hit back with some buckshot at the tiny aircraft that are hunting them. At the same time, we've suddenly seen on the northern border Ukraine-style cages and wire mesh on armored vehicles and even on tents all around them to disrupt the incoming FPVs. And it's one of the strange, I suppose, visual ironies of the modern battlefield. You have very advanced militaries defending themselves against hobbyist-style drones using metal cages and shotguns. But perhaps it shouldn't be surprising because low-tech threats often force low-tech solutions. And the lesson is that not every battlefield answer is a billion-dollar system. I think that in the story of Israel's drone deficit, there's a deeper irony running through over here. Because when it comes to Shabtai Bril and Abe Karem, the original Israeli drone pioneers were themselves the same had been dismissed because they look unserious. Toy planes and improvised systems and hobbyist gadgets. And decades later, the battlefield is rewarding the same innovation and breakthrough that has emerged elsewhere, rewarding precisely those kinds of low-cost innovations over elite, beautifully produced systems. And Israel, along the way, became very successful at building advanced systems, the Iron Dome, the Arrow, precision strike systems, and obviously elite intelligence breakthroughs that can hack through enemy intelligence. But FPV warfare rewards something different: mass and cheapness, speed, decentralized innovation, and rapid battlefield adaptation. And the IDF is scrambling to respond here. We're told reports that the IDF is building its own production lines, actually staffed and manned by, I think, Haredi soldiers who are going to be turning out tens and tens of thousands of these things. So Israel is scrambling to catch up and to close the gap on what may prove to be one of the defining military lessons of the 21st century. I think in this story of Israel's battle and the fear that has been created over these FPV drones, there's perhaps a final lesson. And I'll tell you the following story. The lesson is really about how we as thinking and believing Jews should relate to this whole scramble, the ceaseless effort to match and outmatch an enemy. How should we think about this in terms of emunah, of belief? So one of my favorite stories is about a man called Ari Sacher, one of the engineers behind the Iron Dome. I've written about this and I've said this repeatedly, but I'll say this again in this forum. He's one of the original engineers, American-born engineers, who was working on the Iron Dome system, and he was actually sent because he is Ari, if you're listening, is a very entertaining speaker as well as being undoubtedly a talented engineer. And he was sent to brief Congress in the long, arduous process of development of the Iron Dome system. They needed funding from Congress, and he had to provide the congressman with key insights into why the system was going to be so revolutionary. And I once saw him speak in a Kirov, an outreach setting in Tel Aviv in front of a secular audience, and he said it was actually just before Purim, and he said one of the most remarkable things. He told the story and then asked a question. He said the story had been going around, must be about 15 years ago, of a time when Hamas probably in 2008, fired a Qassam rocket at Tel Aviv, and the Iron Dome system responded once and missed, responded for a second time and missed. And given the short distance, there was no time for a third missile, and this Qassam rocket was headed straight for the Azrieli Towers in the center of Tel Aviv, and obviously would have caused on impact mass casualties. They didn't know what to do. That was it. The system had missed. And then out of nowhere came an enormous wind, or so the story went, an enormous gust of wind that took this missile from its trajectory to central Tel Aviv and hurled it into the sea. That was the story, and people had actually heard it. Whenever he spoke 10 years ago, people had heard of this story. And Ari got up and he said, a show of hands, who believes that this was true? And surprisingly, given the audience, actually probably about 40% of the audience put up their hand and said, yes, they believed it's true. And Ari said to them, actually, it's not true. And here I'll explain to you why. Very simply, if given the distances involved, if a gust of wind was going to be powerful enough to divert a missile from the center of Tel Aviv a couple of miles down towards the beach into the sea itself, that wind, that tornado, that cyclone and hurricane would have needed to be so powerful, it would have knocked the entire Israeli center into the sea itself. And so he said, that's why it can't be true. And then he said, but here's why it doesn't matter. Here's why it doesn't matter. Because why do we only think of a miracle as a wind that comes out of nowhere and chucks a missile 2 miles off course? Do we not think it's also miraculous, the very creation of the Iron Dome? Yes, it is. Because the creation of the Iron Dome was itself miraculous. The fact that the engineering came online just when Israel needed it. The fact that the funding came and that people backed it against the other proposals. It's very hard to back a huge, costly missile project like that when so many people and bureaucrats want to defund it. So many politicians have better ways to spend the money. All of that is miraculous. The Iron Dome is miraculous. And he went on to say that that was the lesson of Purim. Purim itself was a hidden miracle, the Iron Dome being a hidden miracle. Ari Sacher's words are perhaps worth remembering in this latest crisis of the drone age as well. Because Israel is clearly being caught on the hop by this latest revolution in warfare. And the battlefield is changing. You have cheap drones that are forcing even the most sophisticated militaries to improvise with crazy stuff like cages and shotguns. But the history of warfare has always moved in waves. Breakthrough and counter-breakthrough. Weapon and response. Innovation and surprise. And perhaps a thinking Jew should remember, behind all that ebb and flow, behind the technologies and the doctrines and the improvisations and the material shell, lies something larger than the battlefield itself. So as Israel faces its drone deficit, it's time, I think, to look to the heavens once again. Thank you for listening to Behind the Times. We appreciate you joining us as we explore the stories and people that shape Jewish history. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends. Until next time.